On a spring day in late May of 1940, within the imposing stone walls of Berlin's Reich Air Ministry, a moment of profound historical irony unfolded that would come to symbolize one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in military history. Hermann Göring, who held the impressive titles of Reich Marshal of Nazi Germany and Supreme Commander of the Luftwaffe, sat in his ornate office reviewing the latest intelligence reports that had arrived from across the Atlantic Ocean. The Reich Air Ministry building itself was a monument to German aviation ambitions, a massive stone structure that dominated the Berlin skyline and served as the nerve center for what Göring and Hitler believed would be the world's most powerful air force. On this particular day, among the various documents and reports that crossed Göring's massive desk was a detailed intelligence analysis of a recent speech delivered by American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to the United States Congress. The report contained a comprehensive breakdown of Roosevelt's audacious and seemingly fantastical request for a massive expansion of American aircraft manufacturing capabilities, specifically outlining his demand that America develop the industrial capacity to produce a minimum of 50,000 military aircraft within a single calendar year. Göring's reaction to this piece of intelligence was one of open mockery, derision, and contempt. The Reich Marshal was known for his flamboyant personality, his love of luxury and pageantry, his collection of art and jewelry, and his absolute confidence in German superiority. With a dismissive gesture that spoke volumes about his attitude, he tossed the intelligence document aside as though it were worthless garbage. His face twisted in an expression of scorn and disdain. Turning to address the assembled staff officers who stood at attention in his office, senior Luftwaffe commanders who waited for his every pronouncement, he delivered what he clearly believed to be a devastating and definitive critique of American industrial ambitions and capabilities. The Americans, he declared with the absolute certainty of a man who had never seriously questioned his own assumptions, were clearly desperate and frightened if they imagined that such transparent bluffing and empty boasting would somehow intimidate the German Reich. His voice, famous for its booming quality and theatrical delivery, dripped with scorn and contempt as he continued his dismissive assessment of American capabilities. The Americans, Göring insisted with unwavering conviction, understood absolutely nothing about the true nature of industrial power, particularly when it came to the extraordinarily complex and technically demanding field of military aircraft production. Building combat aircraft, he lectured his staff with the air of a man explaining simple facts to children, was not like manufacturing automobiles or refrigerators or any other consumer goods. Let them make the attempt to convert their automobile factories to aircraft production, he proclaimed with absolute confidence in his prediction. They would swiftly and painfully discover that constructing combat aircraft demanded far more sophistication, far more technical expertise, far more specialized knowledge than simply establishing assembly lines designed for commercial vehicles. Aircraft production required precision engineering, specialized materials, skilled craftsmen, complex tooling, and years of accumulated expertise. The idea that America could simply convert automobile plants to aircraft production was, in Göring's view, laughably naive and completely divorced from industrial reality. What the Reich Marshal utterly and completely failed to comprehend in that moment of supreme confidence and arrogant certainty was that across the ocean in the industrial heartland of America, specifically in Detroit, Michigan, an immigrant who had arrived from Denmark decades earlier was already in the active process of demonstrating just how catastrophically, tragically, and completely wrong every single one of Göring's assumptions actually were. William Signius Knudsen, a man who had risen through determination, skill, and remarkable organizational ability to become one of the most respected and accomplished executives in American industry, had recently accepted a special appointment directly from President Roosevelt himself. For the symbolic and token salary of merely $1 per year, a gesture that emphasized his patriotic service rather than personal profit, Knudsen had agreed to serve the United States government as the chief coordinator and organizer of all American production efforts for the coming conflict. Behind the scenes, away from the bombastic speeches and public pronouncements that dominated newspaper headlines, away from the political debates and congressional hearings, this quiet, methodical, and supremely competent engineer was methodically and systematically orchestrating what would ultimately become the most massive, comprehensive, and transformative industrial mobilization that human civilization had ever witnessed in its entire history. The scale of what Knudsen and the teams working under his direction would accomplish over the following years would make Göring's contemptuous predictions and dismissive mockery look not merely incorrect or mistaken, but absurdly, tragically, and almost comically misguided. American factories would not produce the 50,000 aircraft annually that the Reich Marshal had so casually and contemptuously dismissed as impossible boasting, as desperate propaganda, as fantasy disconnected from industrial reality. Instead, in less than 4 years from that moment in May of 1940, in a time frame that would have seemed impossibly short to any reasonable observer, American industrial facilities scattered across the continental United States would be delivering nearly 100,000 military aircraft each and every year to support the Allied war effort. And this unprecedented, almost unimaginable production would occur while American industry simultaneously manufactured the vast quantities of equipment, vehicles, weapons, ammunition, and supplies necessary to support 2 entirely separate and massive military campaigns being conducted across 2 different oceans, literally thousands upon thousands of miles from American shores, requiring supply lines of unprecedented length and complexity. The dramatic announcement that had provoked such scorn, such contempt, such dismissive laughter from the German leadership had come just 12 days earlier, on the 16th day of May in 1940. The precise timing of Roosevelt's speech was no coincidence, no random scheduling decision. Even as President Roosevelt stood before the assembled members of Congress in the Capitol building in Washington, making his audacious declaration about American industrial potential, German panzer divisions equipped with the most modern tanks and supported by tactical air power were slicing through French defensive positions with terrifying speed and devastating efficiency. The German war machine, perfected through years of rearmament and tested in Poland and Norway, appeared absolutely unstoppable to contemporary observers. The democratic nations of Western Europe seemed powerless and helpless before the onslaught of modern mechanized warfare. It was against this backdrop of apparent and undeniable Axis invincibility, at a moment when German military power seemed to have no equal and no counter, that Roosevelt addressed the American legislature with words that many members of Congress and many military experts considered pure fantasy, impossible dreams disconnected from reality. He told Congress in clear, unambiguous, and unequivocal terms that he wanted to see the United States prepared and equipped with the industrial capability to produce at minimum 50,000 aircraft within a single calendar year. This was not a vague aspiration or a distant goal, but an immediate demand for action. The reaction to Roosevelt's declaration was widespread skepticism, doubt, and disbelief, and this incredulous response was by no means limited to hostile foreign powers or ideological opponents. Even among America's closest allies, even among members of Roosevelt's own Democratic administration, even among experienced military officers and industrial experts, the production goal seemed impossibly ambitious, wildly unrealistic, and potentially damaging to American credibility. The cold, hard numbers told a sobering and discouraging story that seemed to validate the skeptics. During the entire year of 1939, a year in which war had already begun in Europe and military aircraft were clearly going to be crucial to any future conflict, American factories had managed to produce a total of just 3,611 military aircraft of all types. This figure included trainers, light aircraft, observation planes, and combat aircraft all combined. The Army Air Corps, which represented America's primary military aviation force and would eventually grow into the mighty Army Air Forces, possessed merely 1,700 combat-ready planes in its entire inventory at the beginning of 1940, and the vast majority of these aircraft, perhaps 70 or 80% of the total force, were already considered outdated, obsolete, or inferior by the rapidly evolving and increasingly demanding standards of modern aerial warfare. Most American military aircraft in 1940 were biplanes or early monoplanes that would have been completely outclassed by modern German or British fighters. Yet despite these obvious and undeniable limitations, despite the enormous and seemingly unbridgeable gap between current capacity and stated goals, despite the apparent impossibility of the task, President Roosevelt was demanding a 14-fold explosion in production capacity within just a few years. The man who would transform this seemingly impossible vision, this apparent fantasy, into concrete reality was the Danish immigrant William Knudsen. When presidential advisers and cabinet members engaged in serious debates about who could possibly achieve such monumental and unprecedented production targets, about who possessed the combination of skills necessary to accomplish this apparently impossible task, the financier and longtime presidential counselor Bernard Baruch offered a response that became famous for its emphatic certainty and absolute conviction. When asked directly who should lead this unprecedented industrial mobilization, who should be given responsibility for the most massive production program in human history, Baruch replied with a three-part answer that left no room for doubt or alternative suggestions. First, Baruch said emphatically, Bill Knudsen. Second, he repeated with the same conviction, Bill Knudsen. And third, he concluded, Bill Knudsen. There simply was no one else in America, possibly no one else in the entire world, with the necessary combination of technical expertise, industrial experience, organizational capability, and personal qualities necessary for the monumental task that lay ahead. Knudsen's personal sacrifice for his adopted homeland, for the country that had given him opportunities he never could have found in Denmark, was considerable and worthy of note. At General Motors, where he had risen to become the president of the corporation, one of the largest and most successful companies in the world, he had been earning an annual salary of $300,000. This was an enormous sum in 1940s currency, equivalent to perhaps $5 or $6 million in contemporary purchasing power, enough to maintain a lifestyle of considerable luxury and comfort. He voluntarily and willingly abandoned this substantial income, walking away from financial security and corporate power to serve the United States government for the token symbolic payment of exactly $1 per year. But what Knudsen brought to the position was genuinely priceless, worth far more than any salary could possibly reflect. He brought the accumulated wisdom and practical knowledge of decades spent perfecting and refining the principles of automotive mass production. Knudsen understood better than perhaps anyone alive how to organize complex factories with thousands of workers, how to streamline intricate production processes involving hundreds of steps, how to coordinate vast supply chains spanning hundreds of suppliers, how to manage massive industrial operations involving millions of parts and components. Now he would apply all of this hard-won knowledge, all of this accumulated expertise, directly to the unprecedented challenge of aircraft manufacturing, a field that had previously relied almost exclusively on craft production methods and skilled artisans rather than true mass production techniques developed in the automotive industry. The monumental transformation of American industry began with remarkable speed and absolutely no lengthy period of theoretical planning. There was no time for committees to study the problem for months, no opportunity for academic research into optimal approaches, no luxury of gradual implementation. Instead, Knudsen and the teams working under his direction immediately began implementing sweeping changes across the entire American industrial landscape. Factories were redesigned, supply contracts were negotiated and signed, workers were recruited and trained, equipment was ordered and installed. By the time December of 1941 arrived, bringing with it the shocking Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and America's formal entry into the global conflict that would become known as the Second World War, American factories were already producing an astounding 2,000 military aircraft every single month. This represented a 20-fold increase, a multiplication by a factor of 20, compared to production levels from just 2 years earlier in 1939. The expansion was breathtaking in its scope, unprecedented in its speed, and absolutely crucial to the eventual Allied victory. The Ford Motor Company, the automotive giant founded by Henry Ford and known worldwide for its innovative assembly line production of automobiles, announced ambitious plans for an enormous new facility dedicated exclusively to the production of heavy bomber aircraft. This plant, which would be constructed at a location called Willow Run in Michigan, near Detroit and adjacent to existing Ford facilities, would become absolutely legendary in the annals of industrial history, a symbol of American productive capacity and a name that would haunt German military planners. Boeing, the Seattle-based aircraft manufacturer with decades of experience building military and commercial aircraft, dramatically expanded its existing operations throughout the Pacific Northwest, transforming relatively modest production facilities into massive industrial complexes that dominated the Seattle skyline. Douglas Aircraft, another established aircraft manufacturer based in Southern California, embarked on an extremely aggressive hiring campaign, bringing thousands upon thousands of new workers into their expanding facilities to support the mushrooming demands of military production. Workers who had never seen an aircraft before, who knew nothing about aviation, who had spent their lives as farmers or salespeople or teachers, suddenly found themselves building some of the most complex machines ever created. The arsenal of democracy, the term that Roosevelt had coined to describe America's role as the supplier of weapons and equipment to nations fighting tyranny, was rapidly awakening to its full potential and beginning to demonstrate capabilities that would astonish the world. The contemptuous dismissal of American capabilities by Nazi leadership, the absolute certainty that America could never become an industrial threat to Germany, stemmed from a toxic and deadly combination of several different factors that reinforced each other. Racial prejudice played an enormously significant role in German thinking, as Nazi ideology placed enormous emphasis on supposed racial hierarchies. Deliberate ideological blindness, the unwillingness to see facts that contradicted preferred beliefs, prevented German leaders from assessing reality clearly and objectively. This combination of racism and willful ignorance had serious and ultimately fatal consequences for German war planning, as competent German intelligence officers stationed in America were providing accurate and detailed assessments that were simply being systematically ignored by leaders in Berlin who preferred comfortable myths to uncomfortable truths. General Friedrich von Bötticher, a career German military officer who served as the military attaché in Washington from 1933 all the way through 1941, a period of 8 crucial years, sent numerous detailed reports back to Berlin documenting in precise detail the industrial preparations underway across America. His telegram from December of 1940, transmitted through diplomatic channels and marked as urgent, contained an explicit and unmistakable warning that American military production output would soon reach scales that would seem unimaginable, incomprehensible, and impossible by European standards. Von Bötticher had travelled extensively throughout America, had visited factories and shipyards, had spoken with industrialists and engineers, had carefully observed the transformation underway. His reports were based on solid intelligence, careful observation, and sound analysis. Berlin's response to these crucial intelligence reports, to these urgent warnings from an experienced military officer with direct access to American industry, was dismissive in the extreme and bordering on criminally negligent. The warnings were casually waved away, filed and forgotten, dismissed as the exaggerations of a defeatist, someone whose nerve had failed and who was seeing phantom threats where none existed. When General von Bötticher finally secured a personal meeting with Adolf Hitler himself in February of 1939, traveling from Washington to Berlin specifically to discuss American industrial capacity in a face-to-face briefing, the Führer spent virtually the entire meeting raving incoherently about supposed American racial degeneracy, rather than listening seriously and carefully to the vital military intelligence being presented by an experienced officer. Hitler proclaimed with the absolute certainty characteristic of his pronouncements, with the conviction of a man who never questioned his own ideology, that Americans were a mongrel race, half Judaized and half negrified in his racist terminology, and completely incapable of sustaining the kind of long-term industrial mobilization and sustained effort that modern warfare demanded. Americans, in Hitler's ideologically distorted view, were too soft, too diverse, too democratic, too individualistic to ever compete with the supposed discipline and unity of the German folk. This ideological arrogance, this absolute refusal to see past racist mythology to industrial reality, this preference for comfortable lies over uncomfortable truth would ultimately prove absolutely catastrophic for the entire German war effort and would help seal the fate of the Third Reich. The practical implementation of Roosevelt's ambitious vision faced enormous challenges, serious obstacles, and repeated setbacks, even with Knudsen's experienced leadership and organizational genius. The transformation from automobile production to aircraft production was not smooth or automatic, but required solving countless problems, overcoming numerous obstacles, and developing entirely new techniques. The Ford plant at Willow Run provides perhaps the perfect illustration of both the difficulties involved in this unprecedented transformation and the ultimate success that American industry achieved through persistence and innovation. When construction began on the massive facility in 1941, it represented the largest room under a single roof anywhere on Earth, a building of almost incomprehensible size. The structure stretched nearly a mile in length, contained over 3.5 million square feet of floor space, and was designed to accommodate the assembly of B-24 Liberator heavy bombers, enormous four-engine aircraft weighing over 60,000 pounds fully loaded. But massive size alone did not guarantee success or efficiency. The initial phases of production were absolutely plagued with serious and embarrassing problems that threatened the entire program. Quality control failures reached an alarming and unacceptable rate of 50%, meaning that fully half of all components being produced were defective, unusable, and had to be scrapped or reworked. By February of 1943, more than a year after production had supposedly begun, Willow Run was managing to produce only 56 complete bombers per month, a figure far below the hundreds that had been optimistically projected and confidently expected by Ford executives and military planners. The problems seemed insurmountable. Parts didn't fit together properly. Tools broke frequently. Workers made mistakes. The assembly line stopped repeatedly. Critics in the press and in Congress began sarcastically referring to the facility as "Will it run?", questioning whether it would ever function as intended or whether the entire project had been a massive waste of resources. Yet the American response to these serious setbacks and embarrassing failures demonstrated the fundamental strength and resilience of the democratic industrial system in a way that authoritarian systems could never match. Rather than attempting to hide the failures, cover up the problems, or punish those responsible as might have happened in Germany or the Soviet Union, American engineers and workers openly collaborated to identify problems systematically and implement practical solutions. They redesigned fixtures and specialized tools to dramatically improve precision and reduce defects. They reorganized workflows and rearranged workstations to eliminate bottlenecks and reduce wasted motion. They invented entirely new equipment and tools that had never existed before, including revolutionary hydraulic riveting tools that dramatically improved both the speed and quality of assembly operations. They developed prefabricated wiring harnesses, complete electrical systems that could be installed as single integrated units rather than being painstakingly assembled wire by individual wire directly on the aircraft. They implemented truly continuous moving assembly lines, adapting techniques from automobile production to the far more complex challenge of bomber assembly, keeping work flowing smoothly and continuously through the factory without interruptions or delays. Throughout 1943 alone, they successfully incorporated 578 separate design changes, modifications, and improvements while simultaneously and dramatically increasing output levels month by month. The transformation at Willow Run over the course of 1943 and into 1944 was genuinely remarkable and inspiring. By September of 1943, monthly production had climbed impressively to 148 complete bombers rolling off the assembly line. By December of the same year, production had reached 365 aircraft per month, a number that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. But the true breakthrough, the moment when everything came together and the full potential of mass production was finally realized, arrived in April of 1944. During that historic month, the Willow Run facility produced an astounding 428 B-24 Liberator heavy bombers, each one a complex machine containing over 1.5 million individual parts. This incredible production rate meant that on average, one complete four-engine heavy bomber, a sophisticated aircraft capable of flying thousands of miles and dropping tons of bombs, was rolling off the assembly line every 63 minutes. And this extraordinary production continued relentlessly around the clock, 24 hours every day, 7 days every week, with workers on 3 different shifts, keeping the assembly line moving continuously. This single factory, this one facility that German leadership had dismissed as an impossible fantasy, this plant that critics had mocked as will it run, was now producing more complete heavy bomber aircraft than the entire German aviation industry combined across all of Germany's factories. German pilots, the men actually flying combat missions and facing American aircraft in the skies over Europe and North Africa, began to recognize the true scale and terrifying implications of American production dominance during combat operations in North Africa during late 1942 and early 1943. Major Johannes Steinhoff, an experienced and highly skilled fighter pilot who commanded Jagdgeschwader 77, a fighter wing operating in the challenging conditions of the Mediterranean theatre, made increasingly worried and telling observations in his regular reports to higher headquarters. The American pilots, he noted with concern, were no longer the obvious amateurs and green novices that German aviators had initially encountered when American forces first entered combat in North Africa. Their skill levels, their tactical awareness, their combat effectiveness had all improved dramatically and rapidly through hard-won experience. But what Major Steinhoff found most unsettling and disturbing was not the improving quality of American pilots, but rather a different observation altogether, one that had profound strategic implications. There were more American aircraft in the sky every single day, he reported with growing alarm. No matter how many American planes German fighters managed to shoot down in combat, no matter how successful individual missions might be, more aircraft appeared to replace them the very next day. And the numbers of American aircraft seemed to be steadily increasing rather than decreasing despite German combat successes. The implications were deeply troubling for any German officer capable of strategic thinking. This gradual realization of American industrial dominance spread rapidly throughout the German military during the course of 1943 as American forces expanded their operations. On January 27th of that year, American bombers conducted their first raid directly against German territory itself, a milestone that marked a new phase of the war. 64 heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators attacked the important port city of Wilhelmshaven on Germany's North Sea coast. By October of 1943, during what became grimly known as Black Thursday among American bomber crews, a devastating and costly raid against crucial ball-bearing factories in the German city of Schweinfurt demonstrated both American determination and American industrial depth in stark terms. The raid cost the attacking force 60 B-17 Flying Fortresses completely destroyed, with many more damaged. In any previous conflict, in any historical context before this war, such catastrophic losses would have been absolutely devastating to an air force, potentially crippling to future operations, possibly forcing a halt to the bombing campaign while strength was rebuilt over months. But American factories, operating at full capacity thousands of miles away from the combat zone, replaced all 60 destroyed bombers within just 2 weeks. The raids against Germany continued without meaningful interruption, without any reduction in intensity or frequency. The brutal mathematics of the conflict had become completely undeniable and absolutely unchangeable. America could afford to lose aircraft at rates that would have destroyed any other nation's air force. During what military planners called Big Week, an intensive 6-day period from February 20th through February 25th of 1944, American Air Forces launched an absolutely massive and coordinated campaign directly targeting German aircraft production facilities, the factories where Germany's fighters and bombers were being built. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases scattered across England, and the 15th Air Force, operating from bases in southern Italy, together launched an incredible 3,500 bomber sorties against carefully selected German factories, each sortie representing one aircraft flying one mission. The Luftwaffe responded with absolutely maximum effort, throwing everything available into a desperate defense of these vital facilities. German forces suffered very significant losses during these 6 days of intensive combat, somewhere between 262 and 355 fighter aircraft destroyed depending on which set of records you consult, whether you count aircraft damaged beyond repair, and how you account for various categories of losses. But far more critically for Germany's long-term prospects, far more devastating than the loss of aircraft which could theoretically be replaced, approximately 100 veteran German pilots were killed, wounded seriously enough to remove them from combat, or captured during these intensive battles. These were absolutely irreplaceable losses in the truest sense of that word. These were experienced combat aviators, men with hundreds or even thousands of hours of flying time, men who had survived months or years of combat, men who possessed skills and knowledge that took years to develop and could not be quickly or easily replaced, regardless of how many new pilots were trained. General Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most distinguished and experienced fighter commanders, a man who had personally shot down over 1,100 enemy aircraft and who understood aviation combat as well as anyone alive, reported directly to Hermann Göring with devastating and undeniable statistics that painted a bleak picture. Germany, Galland reported with the directness of a military professional, was losing approximately 1,200 fighter aircraft every month through all causes combined, including combat losses, accidents during training and operations, and other causes. German industry, despite operating at maximum capacity and despite the highest priority given to fighter production, was producing roughly 1,000 fighters monthly. The simple mathematics meant the Luftwaffe was slowly bleeding to death, steadily losing strength month after month, unable to maintain its combat power despite maximum industrial effort. Meanwhile, in stark and devastating contrast, American factories were building 2,500 fighter aircraft every single month, while American forces were suffering combat losses of only about 400 aircraft monthly. America was producing more than 6 times as many fighters as it was losing. Germany was losing more fighters than it could produce. The mathematical advantage was absolutely overwhelming and strategically decisive. No amount of tactical skill, no degree of pilot bravery, no brilliance of leadership could overcome such fundamental industrial superiority. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's most successful fighter aces with an incredible 220 confirmed aerial victories achieved over years of combat on multiple fronts, described a particular mission over Brunswick in January of 1944 that perfectly captured the growing hopelessness and futility of the German situation. The stream of American bombers that his unit encountered, he reported with a mixture of awe and despair, stretched literally and completely from one horizon to the other, as far as the eye could see in every direction. He estimated, based on years of experience identifying aircraft formations, at least 700 flying fortresses and liberators in this single massive formation, along with probably an equal number of escorting fighter aircraft protecting the bombers. Against this absolutely overwhelming aerial armada, against this vast fleet of American aircraft that represented more planes than many entire national air forces possessed, Major Baer's unit could muster exactly 8 operational fighter aircraft with fuel and ammunition. 8 German fighters against roughly 1,400 American aircraft. The numerical ratio was beyond hopeless, the outcome completely predetermined before the first shot was fired. There was literally nothing that 8 fighters could accomplish against such overwhelming numbers, regardless of how skilled the pilots might be. By 1944, American aircraft production had reached levels that genuinely defied comprehension, that seemed impossible even when looking at documented official figures. During that single year, American factories produced an absolutely staggering total of 96,270 aircraft of all military types. To put that enormous number in perspective, that meant America was producing more than 264 military aircraft every single day on average, more than 11 complete aircraft every hour of every day throughout the entire year. This total included 16,048 four-engine heavy bombers, the massive B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators that were systematically pounding Germany's cities and industries day after day. It included 35,743 fighter aircraft of various types, including P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and many other designs. It included 22,591 multi-engine aircraft of other categories, including medium bombers like the B-25 Mitchell, transport planes like the C-47 Skytrain, reconnaissance aircraft, and specialized variants created for particular missions. The production total for this single year, just 12 months of American manufacturing, exceeded Germany's total cumulative wartime production of approximately 94,677 aircraft across all years of the conflict from 1939 through 1945 combined. But the disparity between American and German air power extended far beyond mere numbers on production charts and statistical comparisons. Every American four-engine heavy bomber carried a defensive armament of 13 50-caliber Browning heavy machine guns, each one a powerful weapon capable of firing up to 850 rounds per minute, loaded with thousands upon thousands of rounds of ammunition carefully manufactured to precise specifications. German fighters, increasingly struggling with shortages of every conceivable type, shortages of fuel, shortages of spare parts, shortages of trained mechanics, were often being sent into combat with only partial ammunition loads, carrying perhaps only half or even less of their normal ammunition supply because there simply was not enough ammunition available in German supply depots. American heavy bombers featured electrically powered turrets that could track targets automatically using sophisticated computing mechanisms, advanced Norden bomb sights that dramatically improved accuracy and allowed precision bombing from high altitude, and extremely sophisticated navigation equipment, including radio navigation systems that allowed operations in virtually all weather conditions, including complete cloud cover. German fighters, suffering from increasing shortages of everything, frequently flew combat missions with radios that did not function properly or did not function at all, completely unable to communicate with each other or with ground controllers because replacement parts, specialized vacuum tubes, and skilled radio technicians were simply unavailable. Individual American factories achieved production rates that seemed absolutely impossible when described, that sounded like propaganda rather than fact. Boeing's massive Plant 2 in Seattle, Washington, was delivering 16 complete B-17 Flying Fortresses every single day by May of 1944, meaning that roughly every 90 minutes another bomber rolled out of the factory. Douglas Aircraft, a company that had employed merely 68 people total in 1936, just 8 years earlier, had expanded almost unimaginably to employ 167,000 workers spread across 9 different facilities scattered across the United States by 1944. North American Aviation was producing 500 P-51 Mustang fighters every month, arguably the finest piston-engine fighter aircraft developed during the entire war, an aircraft that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back to England and could outfight any German aircraft at any altitude. Lockheed was achieving an absolutely incredible production rate of 1 P-38 Lightning twin-engine fighter every 90 minutes at their California facility, while simultaneously implementing 2,127 separate design modifications based on detailed combat feedback from operational squadrons fighting in every theater of war from Alaska to North Africa. The supporting industries, the companies producing engines and aluminum and countless other components, mirrored this relentless pace of unprecedented production. General Motors, far better known to the American public for manufacturing Chevrolets and Buicks and Cadillacs, built an astounding 57,658 aircraft engines under license from various designers, including Pratt and Whitney and Wright. Packard, a luxury automobile manufacturer famous for building some of America's finest cars, constructed 55,523 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the superb British power plant that was fitted to P-51 Mustang fighters and numerous other Allied aircraft, adapting British designs for American mass production methods. Alcoa, the aluminum company of America, the primary American producer of this crucial lightweight metal absolutely essential for aircraft construction, increased its total output by an absolutely astounding 600% compared to pre-war levels to meet the voracious and seemingly insatiable demand for aircraft-grade aluminum. Dow Chemical's magnesium production, another metal essential for certain aircraft components where extreme lightweight was crucial, jumped from a relatively modest £6 million annually before the war to an absolutely enormous £333 million per year by 1944, an increase of over 50-fold. The transformation of the American workforce during these years completely shattered every single assumption that Nazi ideology had made about democratic societies, about the supposed weaknesses of diverse populations, about the alleged superiority of authoritarian organization. Women, who had represented less than 1%, virtually none, of aircraft industry workers in 1941, comprised an absolutely dominant 65% of the workforce by 1943. More than 310,000 women were working in aircraft production facilities across the United States, performing every imaginable job from riveting to welding to quality inspection to final assembly. At Douglas Aircraft's massive Long Beach, California facility, women made up 22,389 of the plant's total workforce of 41,629 employees, more than half of all workers. Rose Will Munro, who became the iconic face of Rosie the Riveter after being featured in promotional films and posters encouraging women to join the war effort, personally drove 3,000 individual rivets during every single work shift at the Willow Run bomber plant, maintaining an absolutely incredible accuracy rate of 99.5%, meaning that out of every 1,000 rivets she installed, only 5 were defective or improperly set. Female quality control inspectors at Douglas facilities, women who had never seen an aircraft before 1941, reduced the defect rate from a troubling 3.2% down to an absolutely excellent 0.3%, a tenfold improvement in quality that actually saved lives by ensuring aircraft were built correctly. Ford and other manufacturers redesigned thousands of tools and workstations throughout their factories to accommodate workers with smaller hands and less upper body strength, changes initially made to enable female workers to perform physically demanding tasks more easily and safely. Unexpectedly and importantly, these modifications improved overall efficiency for all workers regardless of gender, male or female. Lighter pneumatic tools reduced fatigue for everyone using them during long shifts. Better positioned and more ergonomically designed workstations decreased workplace injuries across the board for all employees. German intelligence services, operating from embassies and through various covert channels, observed the widespread employment of women in American war industries with a mixture of contempt, misunderstanding, and ideological blindness. A captured Luftwaffe intelligence report, written by supposedly trained intelligence analysts, characterized female workers as nothing more than a temporary expedient, a desperate measure, predicting confidently that quality would inevitably and rapidly collapse as these supposedly unqualified workers replaced skilled male craftsmen who really understood the work. The prediction proved exactly, completely, and catastrophically wrong in every respect. Precision and quality improved dramatically rather than declining as women joined the workforce in large numbers. Women proved particularly and consistently excellent at detailed work requiring patience and precision, including intricate electrical wiring involving hundreds of individual connections, delicate instrument installation requiring careful alignment, and meticulous quality inspection requiring attention to detail. Their large-scale inclusion in the industrial workforce was not a sign of desperation or weakness, but rather a powerful demonstration of democratic strength. The ability of an open society to mobilize its entire population in service of a shared goal, rather than wasting half its human resources. As American production climbed month after month to unprecedented and previously unimaginable heights, Germany increasingly retreated into dangerous fantasies, desperate measures, and delusional thinking that denied obvious reality. Hermann Göring authorized a radical initiative called the Jagger Program in February of 1944, a plan to massively disperse aircraft production away from vulnerable above-ground factories into 729 different underground facilities scattered throughout Germany and occupied territories. These facilities, built by forced labor in caves and tunnels, would theoretically be invulnerable to American bombing. The plan would employ forced labor on a massive scale, primarily concentration camp prisoners and enslaved workers from occupied territories, people who had no choice and no freedom. The most notorious of these underground complexes was a place called Mittelbau-Dora, a facility built into mountain tunnels where approximately 60,000 prisoners were forced to work in absolutely appalling conditions that can only be described as hell on earth. Roughly 20,000 of these unfortunate workers, 1/3 of the total, died from the terrible combination of brutal working conditions, completely inadequate food, rampant disease, and outright murder by SS guards. The underground factories, rather than solving Germany's desperate production problems, created entirely new problems that made the situation even worse. Working conditions in the poorly ventilated tunnels were absolutely nightmarish, with inadequate lighting, bad air, and constant danger. Precision equipment and delicate machine tools frequently malfunctioned in the damp, dusty environment. Quality control was virtually impossible. These underground facilities produced more aircraft that were defective, dangerous to fly, and had to be scrapped than they produced usable, airworthy aircraft. Forced labor, it turned out through hard experience, was not merely morally reprehensible and evil, but also practically ineffective and economically wasteful. Prisoners working under threat of death with no stake in the outcome, no reason to care, every reason to sabotage, produced inferior work compared to free workers with a shared purpose. American innovation during this period extended beyond mere production numbers to include remarkable technological advancement that kept American aircraft at the cutting edge. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, which became operational for combat missions in 1944, represented a genuine quantum leap in bomber technology, incorporating features that seemed almost science-fictional. These massive aircraft, the most advanced bombers in the world, featured pressurized crew compartments that allowed them to operate comfortably at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, where the air is extremely thin, altitudes where German piston-engine fighters struggled desperately to reach them and could barely maneuver when they did. They could carry more than 10 tons of bombs, twice the load of earlier bombers, across ranges exceeding 3,000 miles without refueling. Each B-29 cost approximately $65,000 to build, an enormous sum representing months of work by hundreds of people, yet incorporated technology that Germany could not match even in experimental prototype form, despite years of research. By early 1945, American factories were producing 100 B-29 Superfortresses every single month, aircraft that would ultimately force Japan's unconditional surrender without the need for a costly invasion that might have cost 1 million casualties. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, a date forever remembered as D-Day, marked the spectacular peak and ultimate demonstration of American production dominance translated into overwhelming military power. The invasion fleet crossing the English Channel to the beaches of France included air support from an absolutely massive total of 11,590 Allied aircraft of all types, including fighters, bombers, transports, and reconnaissance planes. Against this overwhelming and devastating force that dominated the skies completely, the Luftwaffe, desperately short of fuel, short of pilots, short of aircraft, managed to fly exactly 319 sorties on D-Day itself. The ratio was nearly 40-1 in Allied favour, a degree of air superiority that was absolutely crushing and made German ground resistance far less effective. This was not merely a tactical advantage on a single day, not just good fortune or favourable conditions, but rather the direct and inevitable culmination of industrial triumph stretching back years. Between January and May of 1944, in the months of careful preparation for the invasion, Allied air forces had dropped an absolutely astounding 145,000 tons of bombs on German military targets, transportation networks including bridges and rail yards, and industrial facilities throughout occupied France and Germany. This total tonnage surpassed, completely dwarfed the entire tonnage of bombs that Germany had dropped on Britain throughout the entire war from 1940 through 1945. American transport aircraft on D-Day alone delivered 3 complete airborne divisions, tens of thousands of paratroopers in a single day of operations, using more transport planes than Germany's entire transport fleet had ever possessed at any point during the war. The scale was almost incomprehensible. By December of 1944, individual American bombing raids routinely involved massive formations of 1,200 heavy bombers, each one carrying tons of explosives, escorted by 900 fighter aircraft flying protection. P-51 Mustang fighters, benefiting from external fuel tanks and superb range, had sufficient fuel capacity to escort bombers all the way to targets deep in Poland and back to bases in England, a combat radius exceeding 1,000 miles that would have seemed impossible in 1940. They possessed the performance characteristics, the speed and maneuverability and firepower to challenge and consistently defeat any German fighter aircraft in service. And they existed in such vast, overwhelming numbers that combat losses, even heavy losses during particularly intense battles, had become operationally completely irrelevant to the overall campaign. German pilots, the men actually fighting and dying in the skies, developed a grim nickname for the seemingly omnipresent American Mustangs, calling them Indians in their reports, because no matter where German fighters went, no matter what altitude or location or time of day, they found Mustangs already there or arriving within minutes, swarming everywhere simultaneously like the Indians in American Western films surrounded wagon trains. As Germany's inevitable defeat became undeniable to anyone looking at the situation objectively, even the Nazi leadership itself began to privately acknowledge the production catastrophe and industrial disaster, at least in confidential settings away from public view. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, who had spent years proclaiming German superiority and inevitable victory in speeches and broadcasts, wrote in his personal diary in December of 1944, in an entry never meant for publication, that Hermann Göring's confident promises about Luftwaffe superiority now seemed in retrospect like criminal delusions, dangerous lies that had led Germany to disaster. Germany, he admitted with unusual honesty, was attempting to fight the world's greatest industrial power with little more than rhetoric, propaganda, and wishful thinking. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary commander known as the Desert Fox, who was then responsible for defending France against the expected Allied invasion, told his staff officers before D-Day in a moment of brutal honesty that the Americans could afford to lose 10 tanks, 10 aircraft, 10 ships for every single one that Germany destroyed and still overwhelm German defences through sheer numerical superiority. When the invasion finally came, he predicted with the certainty of someone who understood industrial mathematics, the Allies would arrive with such absolutely overwhelming material dominance that no defensive position could possibly hold regardless of how bravely German soldiers fought. Even Adolf Hitler himself, the man ultimately responsible for every German strategic decision, eventually acknowledged the terrible industrial miscalculation that had doomed Germany, though his admission came far, far too late to change anything. In a conversation with Albert Speer, his Minister of Armaments and War Production, and one of the few subordinates Hitler still trusted, in January of 1945, as Soviet armies approached Berlin from the east, Hitler confessed with unusual candour that Germany should have listened carefully to General von Boettcher's detailed intelligence reports about American industrial potential back in 1939 and 1940. America's industrial capacity, Hitler admitted in a rare moment of accepting reality, had been absolutely decisive in determining the war's outcome. While Germany built hundreds of aircraft, America built tens of thousands. The simple mathematics had determined the outcome before serious fighting even began. Albert Speer, when later testifying before Allied investigators after Germany's surrender, provided detailed statistics documenting the devastating impact of American strategic bombing on German industry. He calculated carefully that American air operations had reduced German tank production by 35% compared to what would have been theoretically possible without the sustained bombing campaign. Aircraft production had been cut by 31% below potential. Truck production, absolutely vital for military logistics, had fallen by 42%. Speer stated unequivocally and without reservation that the American attacks, which followed a systematic and carefully planned approach targeting specific industrial sectors rather than random bombing, had directly caused the breakdown and collapse of German armaments production. Without the sustained aerial assault stretching over years, he testified, Germany could have continued the war significantly longer, perhaps years longer, with correspondingly higher casualties on all sides. The Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, one of the few areas where German technology genuinely led the world, represented Germany's desperate last hope for some kind of aerial technological superiority that might offset American numerical dominance. This remarkable aircraft, revolutionary for its time, which became operational in mid-1944, was genuinely impressive from a technical standpoint. It flew approximately 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter aircraft then in service, fast enough that conventional piston-engine fighters absolutely could not catch it in level flight under any circumstances. The jet's speed advantage seemed decisive. Hitler and Göring believed desperately, clinging to this hope, that this wonder weapon could somehow restore German air superiority despite the absolutely overwhelming numerical disadvantage that the Luftwaffe faced. But Germany's shattered industrial base, operating in dispersed underground factories with forced labour and constant shortages, managed to produce only 1,430 Me 262s total throughout the entire remainder of the war. Never were more than 200 of these revolutionary jets operational simultaneously, and usually the number was far lower. The advanced turbojet engines, pioneering technology that had never been mass-produced before, required complete overhaul after merely 10 hours of operation due to metallurgical limitations. Critical strategic materials, including special heat-resistant metals, were completely unavailable, forcing desperate manufacturers to use inferior substitute materials that dramatically reduced both performance and reliability. The result was an aircraft,